Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Comps List Radio. This is a very special episode as we have Dr. Grant Madsen from Brigham Young University pinch hitting for Marie Totten. This voice in your ears is Robert Ferguson at Arizona State University in the Center for American Institutions, your regular host. But again, we are being joined by Dr. Grant Madsen today from Brigham Young. And so we've had to do a little bit of a reshuffling. I think in the last episode I said we were going to do John Hope Franklin this week, but we wanted to wait till Marie could be back for that. And so we've decided to do a different book. And one that I think fits neatly with some of the work, some of the research that Dr. Madsen has done. And so this should be a really exciting, should be a really good episode. And Dr. Grant Madsen, for those who don't know, is also the chief editor at HPOL. So we're bringing in the heavy hitters for this. Grant, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. This is obviously a dream come true. Ever since I heard your first episode a couple months ago, this is
it's your lifetime, it's your lifelong dream, huh?
Right. I'm be here. Marie can't be here in her usual spot, but I think it's gonna be a lot of fun. I'm excited to be part of this.
Yeah. We've had some fun in the past, and we're definitely excited I'm really excited to talk about this book with you. We've kind of been, kind of hinting with each other over some texts and some emails over the last week. So I'm glad we can actually start sinking our teeth into it.
Right.
We've decided to do William Appleman Williams's Tragedy of American Diplomacy, which is a classic in the diplomatic history field. For those who do diplomatic history, this is probably still going to be on your comps lists, I imagine. But if you're not doing diplomatic history or American foreign relations history, then this might not have been on your comps list. So it's probably a good one to walk through. Grant, did you? Yeah, I'm assuming you read this book in grad school.
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, I wanted to add one thing because I think the last thing you and Marie talked about, the last book you and Marie talked about was Lewis Hart's, right? And I think that in some ways this fits really neatly because it is very much, this book, I think we're going to talk about it, I'm sure, very much of its moment. It's hard to imagine this book getting written any other time than like the late 50s, maybe early 60s, and is written in that sort of style of, consensus. This is the essence of America, that would be popular in the 1950s. But it's sort of like the bizarro version, right? The other side of the coin, the dark what is shadow or reflect
through the glass darkly.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of it's anyway. It's like the inverse of the story Hart is telling, but can tell kind of neatly because it can on the one hand. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of it. I know, but on the one hand, it's affirming the Hartian story of the liberal America that has good intentions, freedom and democracy and apple pie and all that kind of stuff. But as soon as that vision leaves American shores, it becomes inverted and becomes this. I know as a term for this, but it's dark opposite. It's verse, alternative. And so anyway, so I know that you had some. John Hope Franklin would have been great also, but I think this still fits within kind of the unfolding of works that we've been talking about. And yes, so I don't know that it was. I think that it would have been. It was on my reading list in part because, like a lot of people of my generation, I started around the time of the internationalization of American history. So I was doing a lot of catch up to figure out what at least diplomatic historians have been talking about for a long time, and that meant I went to what were the classics. Right, I started from the very beginning. So this is one of the first things I read, along with some of the other classics in diplomatic history. So anyway, so yeah, this is perfect. I'm excited to talk about this.
Yeah, me too. Grant, maybe can you tell people a little bit about your own research?
Yeah, so I'm a political historian. Obviously, that's what brings us to this webpage and the network. But I've done a lot of work in sort of mid 20th century international finance and economic history. So I spent a lot of time trying to just understand what happens to American policy when it leaves the shores of the country. So very much like William Appleman Williams. My own work has tended to focus on, I'm also writing after the policy history or political development turn in political history. So I tend to be more focused on institutions and particularly, at least the work I've done specifically in political history is focused on the military and the way that policy gets made in the military, which, but in areas you wouldn't expect the military to make policy. So in occupations where you have military leaders figuring out tax collection and garbage collection and post offices, but also making a lot of economic policy. And so basically, how do they develop policy? How do they develop policy expertise? That kind of stuff.
And well, and this would be a great time to plug your book.
Yeah, so Sovereign Soldiers, that's the name of the book. And yes, if anybody, yeah, it's if this is this framework is of interest, I'm also happy to email and talk about how basically this idea of American institutions functioning semi-independently outside of the bounds of the actual political United States, right? So this idea that we have military bases all around the world, we have commitments, we have occupations, constantly ongoing. It seems like so that it's a you kind of want to think about like how do we think about American governing institutions when they're disconnected from the actual American state in important ways, geographically most of all. So there's a phrase I like to use in the book called the external state, right? The idea of a state that's outside the boundaries of the United States. Yeah, thanks. It wasn't my intention, but Rob, you're good to me. I appreciate you letting me plug the book.
Well, it's a great book. I read it over the Christmas holidays this year, so and I really enjoyed it. So and I paid full Amazon rack rate, so I want to make sure you get all like 3 cents of your royalty.
Thanks. Yeah. No, I just paid taxes, and so I gave the government back, some fraction of a penny based on your purchase.
Um, okay, so we were at a panel last year at the Policy History Conference on the and we don't need to get into the ins and outs of the panel, but one of the things that came up is one of the participants of the panel. He recently wrote an article called like "Tragedy Revisited," tragedy again, about William Appleman Williams, and we don't need to go into his perspective on it necessarily. But what is it about this book?
Is that Ryan Irwin? Yeah,
right. Yeah, Ryan Irwin. Yeah. What is it?
Anyway.
What is it about this book? It's still with us.
Yeah, right. So I think it's a good question, and I actually would trust your perspective in some ways more than mine because you're a little closer to comps lists. You probably took I don't know, when did you take your comprehensive exam?
2022, 2021, 2022, something.
Yeah, it's probably a little more familiar to you in some ways. I think that I think that I would answer it by saying it fills certain functions that are very useful to the whole enterprise we're involved in, right? So for one, it's kind of the original early heterodox position within diplomatic history. I mean, the field hadn't been around all that long and had functioned around a kind of consensus about the origins of the Cold War and the intentions of American foreign policy. And so, the first entrant always gets a little bit more play than everybody who follows. And so he kind of pioneered the whole idea of thinking about American foreign policy not as triumph, but not as the noble expression of a free-loving democratic people, but as tragedy, as a betrayal of those very ideals. But then the other thing is the framework he chose, the framework of empire. He had to, of course, change the meaning of that term a little bit in order to use it. And so he kind of pushed the whole notion of empire to, it doesn't have to be sort of a formal system of colonies with an imperial office within the central government. It can function in other ways, as a, an open door empire, as he kind of explains it. But that whole framework of empire has caught on and has been remarkably flexible. So that I think that I would say most diplomatic historians today function within a notion of empire that may not be identical to what William Appleman Williams articulated, but is certainly inspired by it, right? Because implicit in the notion of empire is a kind of power differential as expressed through foreign policy, and the way one country can, in a sense, impose its will on other countries in the international scheme. And so, and that idea has been remarkably resilient, right? In fact, my sense is, and so neither of us are diplomatic historians, but at least understanding the literature as we do, I think we both would agree that's the dominant paradigm for anybody working in the field now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be. I mean, it's basically various forms of empire. And of course, as you mentioned, I mean, the definition gets slipperier and slipperier and slipperier as you dig into it, right?
Yeah.
And in some cases, it's just downright abstract, but it's still, I think, a framework that's applied. And Williams himself, actually, and I only picked this up this time reading through it. He actually references Robinson and Gallagher's informal empire arc.
Interesting. Yeah, right.
Which would have been brand new at the time when he wrote this. And so Williams is sort of, and he's explicitly building on Robinson and Gallagher. You can see that influence. Now, Robinson and Gallagher were not, at least not explicitly talking about the United States. They were talking about Great Britain in the latter part of the 19th century. But he's clearly, picked up on and adapting that.
Yeah, right. And I think, I mean, this is why I talked before, right? Like, this book could probably only have been written when it was. Some of the innocence he attributes to the United States, or at least the self-perception of the United States. I mean, to me, it always has felt very autobiographical, right? This feels like his own kind of, I mean, it's almost a cliche. The fact that he was born in Iowa, like, fits perfectly with the almost cliched version of what it means to be kind of a quiet intellectual who grew up in farm country in the Midwest, whatever, the middle of the 20th century. And so, and as an innocent, I think he has that same kind of wonder and doubt that I think probably a lot of people felt when they looked around and they're like, okay, the United States is, in a sense, if not the hegemon in the 50s, but certainly, if not the dominant world power, a dominant world power, right? In a bipolar system, it's at least one of the poles, right? And trying to make sense of what to do with that power. And I know we're going to talk more about this probably, but I always get this very sort of mainline Protestant guilt that sort of seeps through the book, where, I'm not sure, I don't think Williams was particularly religious, but you almost sense that kind of Calvinist, old school, again, it's a cliched way of thinking of it, Midwestern kind of, like, is it, guilt about success. So it kind of, it sort of, I don't know, I read between all the lines, it seems like.
Sure. I'd have to go, sorry to jump in, I'd have to go back and check here, because I read it, but I didn't actually make a note of it. But he actually does at one point attribute American, like the dream of American foreign policy, or like what people think it is, to a Calvinist.
Interesting.
Yeah. It was either Calvinist or Presbyterian. I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was definitely in that same vein. So that's very interesting. That you think that. I mean, I do think that you're right. There's this, he grew up, he went, this is probably a good time to introduce some of his biography. Born in Iowa, went to the Naval College, served in World War II as a line officer, was wounded in World War II, but as I just mentioned to Grant before we jumped on the recording here, was not wounded in battle. He was just wounded sustained a terrible back injury while sailing through difficult seas. Um, but I mean, in many ways, almost certainly joined the Navy out of an incredible sense of patriotism, you know. And that's one of the things that I think separates Williams from later radicals is Williams never loses his patriotism.
I think that's right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think that's one of the criticisms. But I think that's um, but I think that also reflects again the 1950s, early 60s, right? There's no Vietnam War yet, right? And
But even after he lives through the Vietnam War, and he never
no, you're right about that. Yeah,
he never loses that patriotism.
yeah, I think that's right. And it's interesting. And again, on the reread, like, especially at the very end of the book where he kind of talks about the futility of nuclear weapons and stuff. He still, he can be sympathetic to Marxism, which again seems like particularly brave. Right here, sort of in the twilight of McCarthyism, but still very brave. But he's not a Marxist, right? I mean, he's really a progressive in a lot of ways. He's like it's like I mean, I think his sort of intellectual hero is essentially Charles Beard, where he wants to be an economic determinist, but not a Marxist. And uh, and so, and I think you're right. I think that allows him the space to still be patriotic in a certain sense, in the kind of like, I mean, I'm being very armchair psychologist in this, in a kind of Calvinist, full of regret and doubt, but never giving up on the ideal way.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Beard was the same,
Yeah, that's probably right.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah.
Beard. Nobody tried to tear down American shibboleths like Beard did, or American symbols and like the actual and sacred cows. Nobody went after them harder than Beard. Yet for the time, and yet he remained patriotic.
Yeah, right. Right, which is, I mean, I don't know. I feel like uh, I mean, we're kind of venturing into, I'm trying to think of who would say this the best, but I'm thinking of like Brian Ballow, but I'm sure there are other scholars. But the idea that the progressive era is in a lot of ways trying to do that, right? It's trying to Americanize European radicalism, and so Beard is tearing down the heroes of the American past, but in the name of American ideals, right? And in the name of equality, freedom, but also a kind of ethical content, a kind of American virtue that is sober, thoughtful, but caring. And like and like kind of open to well, actually, I think the word would be just friendly, a kind of friendly radicalism that wants to gain converts rather than mount the barricades in a bloody revolution.
Yeah, maybe America is not exceptional, but it should be.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, yeah, and that's again one of the criticisms of this book is that William Appleman Williams sort of remains American exceptionalist in this way. Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, so we've talked enough. He he does, not only is Charles Beard the progressive, and he taught at Wisconsin. He got his PhD at Wisconsin. I mean, he's very clearly trying to take the mantle of Frederick Jackson Turner,
Yeah,
but apply it overseas.
yeah, right. Yeah, right.
And
Exactly.
that
They're economic determinists, as it were. Right.
right. And I remember him being economic determinist when I read it. I don't know he's as economically determinist this reread as I remember him being. But one of the things that I've always appreciated about Williams, whether it was in this book or in fact it's even clearer in some of his later work, is that he's one of the Wisconsin school, which I don't necessarily consider myself part of, but I've always respected it. And one of the things I've always really respected about it is that it treats foreign affairs as if it's an entirely American national project. It doesn't just look at Foggy Bottom.
Yeah, right.
Right? As some of the, if you're at Harvard or if you're at Yale and you're studying it, it's easy to think that it's the foreign offices, it's the State Department and foreign offices talking with each other, and that's what foreign affairs is. Or maybe the Pentagon and later, but or wherever the War Department and Defense Department were before the Pentagon. But with William Appleman Williams, he's looking at foreign affairs as a Midwesterner.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and as a kind of I think what you're about to say is, which it's a weird slippage, right? On the one hand, he speaks of, what did one scholar say? He can still talk about America as a her, he can, or as a she, like he can give a pronoun to the whole nation, but also in a weird way sees himself as an outsider to it, but as an American, right? He's an American who's an outsider, but an outsider of exactly what you're describing. And and I think that this might be, again, I'm being an armchair psychologist, but it feels like this is why he left Wisconsin ultimately, is to get further from the East Coast. So that's why he went out to Oregon, right? It was to get further away from Foggy Bottom and the East Coast institutions. That, and you could add to what you're talking about. Basically Harvard and Yale. He's thinking about like getting further away from people like Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and like that kind of tight, sort of high elite academic institutions working hand in glove with foreign affairs, but also government at all levels. It's sort of like kind of the cliched version of 1960s policymaking.
Sure. Andrew Bacevich, who wrote a piece on Williams and is very inspired by Williams, from a very conservative scholar, but inspired by Williams. And he argued that, that basically what you're saying is that he fled Wisconsin to get further from the East Coast, further from elites. And that, like, when he was in Corvallis, he spent most of his free time in pool halls. And the idea being because he felt most comfortable among the working class.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
Right. And, but anyway, so the other thing that I really like about the Midwesternness of his approach, and I think there's some limitations to it, but one of the things I appreciate is you get a very different sense of these events when viewed through the lens of like congressmen from Nebraska or senators from Wisconsin.
Yeah, right.
Than you do if you're just dealing with State Department officials.
Yeah, right, exactly. And of course, the standard take, especially in this period, is that isolationism came from the Midwest. I guess that's probably still the case today. The coasts are always cosmopolitan, and the center of the country is more isolationist. And that's another way to articulate the same point, right? That he's a little bit of an outsider, not privy to the workings, but in a sense, the moral conscience of those who are making the policy.
Right. But, one of the things that comes through Williams that I've never seen through any other scholar, but I think that Williams has it right, is that I think people assume William Jennings Bryan was kind of a peacenik isolationist, and he was not. He just ran against imperialism in 1900.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
But he was never anti-expansionist. And, when Williams writes about Bryan, he's a jingoist.
Huh. Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
It's just anyways, not just in tragedy, that's in some of his other works as well, but but anyway, we've talked long enough about about Williams about Williams. We psychoanalyzed him, which I always love doing.
We actually get the argument of the book. And,
yeah, this is why I like talking about people who are dead, because I can psychoanalyze them.
We should let our dozen listeners know what's actually going to come up on their comprehensive exam. So
right, okay. So, all right, Grant, what do you think the argument of the book is?
Yeah, so when I actually will teach at least the introduction, and I go back to the 61 or 59, I can't remember what one of the first editions or second editions of the book. He added to the introduction later in 72, where he kind of takes a victory lap and rewrites the introduction to talk all about Cuba as his case in point. But in the original, he gets right to it, and the three arguments that I have to say I still love. I think they're really great. Are so first, he basically says that Americans have a kind of a warm, generous humanitarian impulse. Like our motivation is to help other people around the world. That's our impulse. But we simultaneously support the principle of self-determination. Right? We think that people should have the same sort of rights to democratic expression that we enjoy. But then we also think that in order to do that, we have to sort of remake their world to look a little bit like ours, right? They will only get better if they embrace the kind of liberal, democratic, but especially capitalist world that we inhabit, because that's the pathway to that's the gift that we can give them. So in a sense, we're evangelical, right? We're proselyting. We want to help people, but we want to help them by, in a sense, converting them to a particular worldview, well, Weltanschauung, as he would say, that looks an awful lot like us, right? And that what happens very quickly is that principle 2 and principle 3 get in common. Right, the idea that people should on their own, like people should self-determine, people should make their own way in life, comes in conflict with our sense of, but as long as they choose our way, right? And so the famous expression, this would be Woodrow Wilson, who I can't remember what country authorized an invasion of, set up democratic institutions and then went back because they had elected the wrong people and said, I gave them democracy, now I'm going to tell them how to vote right, essentially. And I'm screwing up the quote in the story, I apologize. But that basic idea of, we're going to, and anyway, so for my students, for undergrads, this is a great framework for understanding a lot of the conflicts that the United States has been in since World War II, right? And why we kind of get pulled into situations, most recently Iraq and Afghanistan, where the ideals are laid out. We're going to spread democracy. We're going to allow for freedom. We're going to protect individual rights. But we get stuck there for a longer and longer period of time because because the countries don't embrace these things in the way we kind of want them to. And so now, okay, all of that I have to say I really like. Where the problems come are when he sort of introduces the economic determinism that follows and says the key component in this third part, this idea of they have to look like us, is that means they have to be part of an open door free trade. Today we would call it globalizing economy. Right? They have to, all nations now have to sort of embrace the kind of free flow of goods and capital across borders. It's part of kind of this American need to, and in his view, solve the problem that the United States had of insufficient consumption and overproduction. We need someplace for our surplus goods to buy those up and then also provide us raw materials. And that's where the kind of imperial vision makes a little more sense, because that's how a lot of imperial systems worked, right? It's the metropole manufactured goods, the periphery provided raw materials, and there's kind of free flow. And with that came an assumption that the United States was always in the power position, almost regardless of who it dealt with, because the United States economy was the biggest. And so as long as there was an imbalance between the bigger trade partner and the weaker trade partner, that this imbalance meant that in a way the U.S. was imposing its will. It was actually in a position to get caught in this tragedy again and again of thinking that it was doing a favor to nations, but then insisting that they adopt, essentially the free flow of goods and so on, and make their economies look like the American economy, which creates a backlash, which creates tensions, and is ultimately unstable. And of course, and in a nod, in a sense, to Lenin, that then will require the American military to show up and enforce, as a kind of gunboat diplomacy, the continued open door free trade, whatever, despite the resentment of the people of the periphery. Right. So that's kind of the analysis in a nutshell. And of course, this lent itself really nicely. So my understanding is that when the book first came out, it wasn't really taken particularly seriously. But as the Vietnam War got off the ground, as a lot decolonization progressed, as newly freed countries in Africa and elsewhere in the world did not immediately embrace capitalism, and so that what followed was increasing American belligerence towards countries that didn't just fall in line. This analysis started to look really prescient and appealing, and so it was sort of like events made a bestseller out of it.
Yeah, I think it turned into prophecy.
Yeah,
I don't know whether that was exactly what Williams intended, but it felt like it turned into prophecy.
right, right. So by 1971 or two, when he rewrote his introduction, he could take a victory lap, right? He could say, "Yeah, this is a great framework for understanding Cuba, right? Which fit the pattern probably as well as any particular international experience in the United States, where the United States did sort of dominate Cuban politics after the Spanish-American War, mostly in the interest, mostly in commercial interests, which did create a revolutionary backlash, which eventually brought Castro to power, and then eventually necessitated the Bay of Pigs, right? A military response that was supposed to reopen this market and so on.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is the thing that ends up, well, there's a couple things. First of all, again, I think it was initially ignored. In my sense is that first of all, maybe the world wasn't ready for it. I don't know, but also it's a Midwestern scholar talking about foreign diplomatic history and stepping all over the people on the East Coast that thought they had a monopoly on this, right? And so by taking this more economic determinist perspective, which the East Coast at the time was like, oh, dismissed out of hand. But there was also this sort of, I think, arrogant who are you from the hinterland telling me my job kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, I believe that's true. Yeah.
And the thing is that I think Williams's framework works really well where it works, and it doesn't work so well where it doesn't.
Yeah. So I don't know. Is this the point where we talk about the criticism?
Well, I mean, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I mean, I'm kind of, unfiltered me is that's where I'm going. But I want to stop on a couple of things first before we get there. I really do want to talk about what he means by the open door.
Yeah, right.
Because this is the key, like, to so much of William Appleman Williams. He has a very specific conception of what the open door means, and as you mentioned, it's like a belt and show.
Yeah,
to him, right?
Yeah, it's not just economic policy, but yeah, elaborate. So elaborate what you're thinking. Yeah, so
yeah. Well, I mean, so one of the problems that you have when you analyze Williams is that with the term the open door is that the open door has a specific legalistic meaning, right? It actually meant something in international law, and I don't know if Hay invents it. I don't know that it does because it's used a lot pretty quickly, and so my sense is that it may have been used already. And Hay just kind of co-opted it, but I'm not an expert on the 1890s, so I don't know. But it does. But what so in the real world, the open door is more than the open door nodes. Williams agrees. He thinks it's a lot more than the open door nodes. But he thinks it reflects this bigger notion of informal empire, where it's this, we need to be able to access every market in the world, right? We aren't necessarily going to administer something as a colony. But just because we're not administering it as a colony doesn't mean we shouldn't have full market access to it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. It's yeah, I don't know. Yeah, Weltanschauung or paradigm or ideology. I'm not sure quite the right way to describe it, but you're absolutely right. It's not legalistic or narrow. It's a whole framework for understanding the global order. And you're right, and it's imperialistic in the sense that it's imposition. It's it's an empire, as lots of diplomatic historians like to say. It's an empire of imposition. It is imposed upon other countries, and so you know, what's the name? Who's the admiral that opened up Japan to American trade? You
Oh,
know,
why am I drunk? Oh, yeah, well, Commodore Perry.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, I mean that's that's what he's talking about. The paradigm that not only says this is a legalistic thing, it is a moral right. You
Right.
know, it is.
And whereas in the kind of the legalistic sense, it's more of an agreement between imperial powers,
Right, right,
right? In the sense that it's like, listen, the open door means that if we are using the open door model, and let's say and it's the British Empire. The British Empire would say everybody can trade in this colony as we trade in this colony, right? Whereas Williams thinks it's not just among imperial powers, it's the whole world,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
That should be open to American trade. And everybody should be permitted to trade equally, according to Williams. So the notion of like, if you want to impose a tariff, you can't impose a tariff because we want national treatment. We want the full open door over your supposedly sovereign, self-determined country.
yeah, right,
Right. And I don't actually know that the history supports that notion as well as Williams would like it to.
Well, okay, so yes, all right. So now we want to pivot to the criticisms. Yeah, so yeah, so the I think the obvious criticism is that the whole basis of this of his framework is that the United States needed trade because it had surplus. Its industrial power produced more than its domestic markets could consume, and so the only way to keep this going was to find outlets for the market. And this, of course, fit, I think, a framework that comes again from Turner, where the idea is unless the country is always expanding, in some ways it will start to decay, right? So unless industry is constantly finding new markets or expanding in some ways, then it will turn on itself. And this is, I mean, pretty obviously a hangover from the Great Depression, where I mean, especially still in the 1950s, the framework was still, well, we underconsumed. We didn't have enough consumption to buy up all of our national products. It's a
Right.
New Deal way of, especially early New Deal way of framing the Great Depression, and so that he's kind of taking that and saying, well, that's again this ideological. This is underpinning the ideology of expansion and open door, and so on. All right, so with that in mind, how do you make sense of the fact that by the 1970s, it's sort of the moment at which his analysis was probably the most appreciated? It was already starting to be wrong because the United States started to import more than it exported, right? Like, I am not sure the United States has been a net exporter in my entire lifetime. And, and, and so as a result, the question is, well, then how does the analysis work when it's other nations, and then again, particularly nations on the periphery, Middle Eastern oil producers or China, that are in essence, I mean, selling their surpluses to a United States market that is voracious, that can consume without limit, and of course the fact that this is sustained in large part by foreign countries then taking their surplus capital and and dropping it back in the United States in order to sustain this kind of unrestrained consumerism. So the shift, so basically the simple way a lot of, I think, scholars have treated it is Williams assumed a producerist United States that by the time his book had caught on was no longer true. We were a consumer nation. And the whole relationship that he describes, the whole logic of the relationship is now reversed. I mean, China would be especially difficult to fit within the Appleman-Williams framework, right? There's a nation that was essentially exactly the legalist. We're talking about the British Empire. I mean, the whole idea of like open door, like in the British Empire, is like you said, equal trade amongst imperial powers. But now China is a sovereign nation and has become incredibly powerful precisely by pursuing its own open door policy with the United States to park its surplus goods and become wealthy from, something like that. And has exactly the framework that you'd say Appleman Williams wants to describe, it also would see. I think we can. All right, I'm positing things. I don't know how things work in China exactly, but my sense is that China also has this anxiety of being hemmed in and needing to keep its markets open in order to survive. Right? That this is part of its purpose. So I don't know. What does that mean? What does it mean if China is a better example of the William Appleman Williams thesis than the United States is today? I don't know, but that would be a criticism of, I think, one of the core criticisms of the book.
Yeah, and this is where I think there's a lot that Williams broadly gets right, and that there's a lot of stuff he narrowly gets wrong here. And I don't want this to turn into to crapping on William Appleman Williams. I'll be honest. I consider myself in some ways following in his footsteps. Okay, I don't. So I don't, want to dismiss everything that he has to say and just get in here to criticize him because I don't respect him. I very much respect him. And but one of the things that he really gets right, and I think I'm sure it was written before, but I don't know. The first half of the book almost it is him basically showing why the liberal rhetoric was there was a lot of hypocrisy in the liberal rhetoric, and that it was a mask for economic interest.
Yeah, right.
And so again, I read this and I go, well, duh. Right? But,
yeah.
In the 1950s, that might have been, for him, that was clearly like a really, he talked about Calvinist guilt. Like, that's this moment where he realized, oh, there's something else going on here. And I thought we were just, what's the Superman quote that I can't remember, something about the American way, right? And
American way, right.
Truth, Justice, and the American Way.
Yeah.
And there's something else going on here.
Yeah.
And so, that part of, he also, again, he is stuck on this notion of overproduction being the major contradiction in capitalism, which, owes a lot to Marxist theory, particularly, Lenin, but Rosa Luxemburg, there's this, that's a major tenet of Marxist theory, is that capitalism breeds overproduction, which creates the crisis of capitalism. And so Williams is sort of adopting that and saying, well, they're going to solve the crisis of capitalism through expansion, right? Which Luxemburg kind of says happens, but what's different is that Luxemburg says that this will, you need terra incognita, you need fully traditional states. You can't have industrialized states, whereas Appleman Williams would say probably doesn't have that same limitation.
Yeah, right. And again, I think he's homegrown, right? Like he's obviously aware of Marxism in those arguments. But, I think he's probably closer to the people he quotes, right? Like he's thinking, he's not, because I don't think he. Right, I don't know. This is another common criticism. I'm not sure where I stand on it, but there isn't a whole lot of. He can sound Marxist in the way it feels like structuralist, like history is proceeding by the logic of the material base kind of thing. But it doesn't seem quite as I don't know what's the word, didactic, as like as a kind of a very unreconstructed Marxist would put it,
or even Beard.
Yeah, right. So he does seem to hold out hope that it might be otherwise.
Well, I think that is the really important distinction between Williams and the Marxists.
Yeah.
Is that Williams really does hope that he's like, we can solve this. We as individual Americans can actually solve this.
Right.
Whereas the Marxists say, of course you can't. Yes, you can through violent revolution and overthrowing capitalism. But Williams does, he believes that you can, that if the American just decided to be happier with less.
Yeah, right.
Right? If the American individual just decided, like, we're going to be happier with less, we're going to let the rest of the world do what they want to do, and we can maintain our freedoms. We're probably going to be a little poor, but that's okay. There's nothing, we'll come up with some new way of making, he's kind of this spiritual individualist.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, and again, it's so easy for me to armchair psychologize him in this way because it feels, again, very, very like Midwestern Protestant, like salt of the earth, get by on less, penny saved is a penny earned. You don't need to be consumerist, and you don't need to have so much, all of that. And so I agree with you. Yeah, I think that's what comes through. And so, but there's always room for rebirth, right? There's always room for a conversion and a rededication to the values to be true in your heart, kind of thing.
America can be born again, and it does not require revolution. It just requires people to be a little better toward this.
Right. I think that's right.
And
so
we're lingering on his Protestantism a lot here again, and we might be treating him as more Protestant than he actually was. But I think there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that in here.
Yeah, I hope it isn't being unfair, but at least for me, it helps me make a lot of sense of the particular position he occupies, because I think that for the next generation of scholars who adopt him, they jettison all of that, right? The revisionists of the 60s and 70s take him to task for being, almost naive and not understanding that he was exactly right about the essence of American foreign policy, and was just deluded to think it could be anything other than that. That once tainted by capitalism, it's destined, still like the Kolkos or some of the other folks in that camp would be just like, it's always been corporate capitalism dominating everything since the early 20th century, late 19th century, something like that, and could not be otherwise. Had to be that way, right? The power is just too overwhelming, So yeah, and then but in the interest of going back to how we started, why we still read him is, but maybe because he was not so dogmatic in that way, it his notion of imperialism could survive in its 21st century guise, because it's still very flexible, right? So I think people read him now, or people who work within empire now. I mean, capitalism just gets folded into culture, but I suppose there's a way you could read contemporary sort of culture as a Weltanschauung, right? Once again, a way of looking at the world that, while he didn't talk about things like race and gender, it's easier for scholars working in the field today to say, yeah, but that was also part of the Weltanschauung that he was trying to say, and it is also imperial, right? Like in the same way he meant it's imperial because it insists that others be like us. It's a framework for making sense of the world and ordering the world, and so it's that flexibility is exactly what's allowed him to remain relevant in a way that I don't think people read the Kolkos or the other revisionists as critical to contemporary debates about empire.
I mean, probably the only one that's still read, but he might even be, I'm going to call him a revisionist, is Wallerstein.
Yeah, maybe so. I don't know if he fits in that. That's a good question. I don't know where he fits though. He seems to come from different. His genealogy, I think, is a little different. I don't think
very different. But he's in the sense of,
no, I think.
But in the sense of this of a systematic structural critique of. But Wallerstein is very explicitly neo-Marxist, and
I don't think
William Appleman Williams, I don't think would have ever seen himself that way.
Right, I think that's right, and I even think I don't know. Someone would know better than me, but I don't think that his students are necessarily. I think they also are kind of flexible in the way that he was, right? I don't know.
The Wisconsin school's pretty heterodox, or or it's not it. And heterodox isn't the right word. Well, maybe it is the right word. Diverse, yeah. You've got it's sort of the it's the union of the old right and the new left. It's where the old right and the new left meet.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And so, and that's, I think, what's so interesting about, especially, the less radical revisionist historians, is that you can legitimately ask yourself, is this guy old right or new left? And you don't, and the answer is, I don't know.
Hey, sorry, did that come through on the?
A little bit, but that's okay. That's just fun.
No,
That just made my point. That just emphasized my point.
my ringtone is the theme song for Brooklyn Nine-Nine. I'm sorry about that, everyone.
That's all right. But okay, you mentioned that there was a roundtable recently done in Passport, which is one of the publications of the of Schaefer, Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations.
Yeah.
What was the general tenor of that?
So first off, let me say I said recently because I'm a lot older than you. It was the 50th anniversary, so it's already like it's from 2009, or I might have run in 2010, but it was to celebrate the 50th anniversary. Right?
The way that I look at it is like, is it pre or post financial crash? If it's post financial crash, it's recent.
Okay, so then yes, that it's recent but barely, right? I think, but yeah. So the tenor, it's very interesting. So people might know this, but apparently, if I'm not mistaken, uh, in one class that William Appleman Williams taught at Wisconsin, he had three TAs, and they were Lloyd Gardner, Walter Lefebvre, and Thomas McCormick, right? So these who became kind of heavyweights in the field, and they were all, I think they were all in the same class, and all the TAs who were like trying to explain to their undergrads, this is what Bill Williams is trying to explain to you. Anyway, they also participated and then told it was so the it was I think there were 16 or 18 scholars that weighed in, including probably his three most famous students, and then a wide range of scholars writing from different vantages. And I think that the consensus is everybody agrees with what we've talked about. They all kind of said, look, there's no way around the fact that it's a hugely influential book, despite the fact that it has a lot of problems. For example, there are no footnotes. It tends to ignore the things we talked about, like any variation in, any what is the word we're looking about? Dissension within the ranks of American policymaking, any sort of division of opinion. In fact, any agency at all. The country just kind of seems to march along according to the logic of the open door, and without much thought or consideration. And it tends to kind of jump around from example to example. It's not exactly a simple chronology and so on. So it's a kind of history that I think they all agreed nobody can get away with writing today very easily, right? It's maybe a senior scholar as their sort of magnum opus, but not a junior scholar who's just gotten tenure, right? Something along those lines. Okay, and then, but the big thing that kind of comes out is the bigger shift that's happened within diplomatic history, and that is that diplomatic historians are much more attuned to things like class, race, gender, are much more attuned to pushback, and then just so that it's not quite a one-sided when the United States sneezes, the world catches cold would be a phrase that might capture that, where it's like everyone sort of does the bidding of the so that we distinguish between empire and hegemony in a way that Williams doesn't quite, where it's not just American will that imposes itself everywhere. There's always, so influenced by post-structuralism, there's always going to be fissures and cleavages in power and that kind of stuff. So, so I would say respectful. The tone was always respectful, but the younger scholars saying, "I'm not sure it's as relevant for me as it would be for senior scholars. But thanks for the notion of an empire. That's useful. Something along those lines." So that's my long-winded summary.
So long, and thanks for the notion of empire.
All right, exactly. And and then some very pointed critiques, right? So a lot of what I said about how the economic analysis hasn't really panned out. Elizabeth Cobbs-Hoffman basically says, the economic analysis is just fundamentally wrong. It just almost everything about it doesn't understand the way global economies work, doesn't understand the way power is implicated in global economies, something along those lines. And then some other criticisms really, and you would expect this, right? Along the lines of the whole style feels reminiscent of, even if Appleman Williams was not part of the elite establishment, he still writes like an elite establishment guy. It's a very sort of kind of, a style that fits a kind of patriarchal white man style, essentially. So those would be some of the criticisms that came up in it. It's a fascinating read. It's not often you get, a book that's worthy of, like, basically on the who's who of a field all weighing in, one after the other.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it still has weight, in a way that, I mean, again, we just did Lewis Hart's. I don't know that Lewis Hart's has weight, or at least if he does, it's not direct.
Yeah, right. And it's different because I will say you're okay. So I agree with you. It feels to me, Sarah, if we can jump back to, hopefully people are listening to these in sequence. But if you haven't listened to the Lewis Hart, it's a great episode. But as I was listening to you and Marie talk, I mean, I was thinking about this question: why is Hart still relevant? And I think Hart's is mostly brought up in order to differentiate contemporary views of political history from the consensus historians, and Hart's in particular, right? To say that Hart's is kind of, again, this sort of style that we can't write anymore. The nation is in essence this. I, as a scholar, have discerned its essence, and I'm going to explain it to you. That whole approach, Williams is writing within it, but the liberal view that the liberal essence that Hart's articulated, is now a foil, whereas the imperial essence that Appleman Williams articulated, like we've talked about already, is still useful, if not in all of its detail, but at least in its flexibility, the way it can capture a lot of American foreign policy in this kind of more informal, less structured, less legalistic imperial sense.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I mean,
so
I think that's I think that's fair.
I think that both of these books are of their moment and make for either great foils or great pioneers. I mean, I guess depending on how you want to view it. Okay.
Well, but one last thing. But part of my point is one thing I was going to say is, if you think Williams is written in an elitist 1950s style, you haven't read Hart's.
Yeah, that's probably true. He's less that way, I'm sure, than Hart's. Yeah, for sure.
It probably felt very democratic the way that Williams was writing it in the 1950s.
No, it's really funny. Yeah, I think that's true, and it's interesting. It is an interesting way in which style follows not just the increasing complexity of the discipline, but also the politics of the discipline, right? So today, I think it's harder to get away with the kind of grandiose claims he makes, partly because disciplinarily, to steal from John Lewis Gaddis, we have more splitters than lumpers. It's just harder to be a lumper, and because there are so many splitters ready to jump on you if you are. But the splitting itself is a kind of political move, right? The idea of, we don't want to leave any voices out, and particularly voices that are not represented in, Foggy Bottom and the halls of Harvard College,
Yeah, and yet I think Williams would say, listen, I'm adding voices that are currently being missed.
Yeah, that's true. Right, which is fair, right? He was offering the counterpoint. Yeah, for sure.
Anyway, I can sit here and talk about William Appleman Williams all day, and tragedy of American diplomacy all day. I would, in fact, I actually, even though it was terribly reviewed, I actually think his later book, Roots of American Empire, is superior.
Interesting.
And that one does have footnotes. And you can tell, he was clearly being criticized for tragedy and even contours of American history, right? Like where there's fewer footnotes, and you could tell he was like sensitive to that. And like in Roots, it's just like.
I think because I know your work a little bit, I think I can guess why you like it better. Because is this the book where he says, ironically, given everything we have just said, the Eastern elites weren't just pursuing their Eastern elite interests. That the open door policy originally came from his fellow Midwestern farmers, who were the ones that were most concerned about having the ability to export their surplus crop. Having survived or the Depression, or maybe even before that. I don't know. Is that where he articulates that vision most clearly?
Yeah, he's we're talking the later 19th century.
Yeah. Okay.
Where it basically he says that the original open door advocates were actually the people who became the populists.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Right, and he says that, but what he doesn't get to, which happens in the book, but 1900, the book kind of ends before 1900. But in 1900 is the switch to basically the United States. More people are living in cities than in the countryside, and the American urban market becomes big enough to basically satisfy American wheat farmers. Kind of that goes away.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so, but again, a way of maybe part of why he's not a Marxist, right? Because you can't. It's hard to sustain the Marxist story when it's Midwestern farmers leading the imperial crusade, right? The imperial capitalist crusade.
Right, and again, and of course, you're gonna. In that book, one thing that he does do is he always refers to them as farm businessmen. He never refers to them as farmers. They're always farm businessmen.
Yeah, right.
Which I like. I appreciate that. But he's very clear. Farmers are capitalists.
Yeah, right.
Right.
It's probably true at the founding of the country, right? That was why
sure.
Jefferson could be pro markets but anti, Alexander Hamilton and industry, right? So,
right.
Because
right.
exporting a lot of cotton and other stuff. But anyway, yeah.
But anyway, yes, I mean, I this isn't going to come up with my research, but there's definitely, I look more at solving the farm surplus problem by expanding overseas.
Yeah. So, okay. Interesting. Yeah. Right.
But I mean, I definitely, I got to say, I was inspired, to some degree by, although I was not really inspired by Williams when I read him as an undergraduate, I dismissed him immediately. And it was only when I was digging into primary sources as a master's and then PhD student that I'm coming up with this, this stuff that I'm seeing, and I'm trying to make sense of it. And I walk out of the archives one day and I went, oh no. Was he right?
Yeah, there you go.
Was he right?
Yeah. Yeah, right. I think we've all had that moment.
Where 15 years later, I'm just sitting in the cold rain outside, the archives in in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, having this moment where I'm like, oh no.
Yeah, it's true. That's funny. Yeah. Well, all right. When your book comes out, I'll look for William Appleman Williams.
Yeah, he'll be cited, I'm sure. But anyway, any final thoughts, Grant, before we?
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for letting me join you. I thought it was a lot of fun. Hope it's of use to our dozen listeners. And,
yeah. Well, we'll hopefully be 2 dozen pretty soon.
Maybe 2 dozen. That's right. I don't know what. I think they'll be disappointed if they were coming expecting Marie. That might drive the numbers down.
Yeah. Well, of course they will, but at the same time, it's this has been good, and we're back on with Marie hopefully next week.
All right.
All right.
Hey,
anyway, Grant, thanks for pinch hitting. That was great.
All right, we'll talk soon.
All right, there we go. Well, thanks a lot, Grant.